Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Chris Shang, and we bring in different leaders from various fields of expertise. And today we have the CISO of Presidio, Dan Lohrmann. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Tell us a little bit about Presidio for those of us don't know, and then tell us, kind of what companies you guys are working with.
Sure. Yeah. Presidio is a digital solutions provider. So we pretty much do the full gamut of technology work. Obviously, I'm focused in cybersecurity area, but we're a global company. Work with all the big technology firms. Work regularly with Google, Amazon, AWS, Microsoft. But obviously, I work with a lot of cyber companies as well. So the CrowdStrikes of the world, Netscope, Zscaler, and I could write down the list. I'm going to leave some people out, but newer companies like Wiz and others. So do quite a bit of work. Really, my main focus is in the public sector. So I'm the field CISO for public sector at Presidio, and I really do a lot of speaking, blogging, and writing. So I do a lot of work, a lot of speaking at conferences around the world. Talk about my recent book, Cyber Mayday and the Day After, and talk about ransomware, but really working with clients around best practices and really focusing on kind of soup to nuts, whatever they need help with around cybersecurity. So from risk assessments all the way through identity management, working with partners in that space, but also really helping them with ransomware attacks and incident response. So the full gamut of cybersecurity services.
Got it. Cool. I have a lot of great questions that we can kind of like dive in deeper around your book, but also just you as a leader in cybersecurity. Before we do that, want to kind of get into your background. I don't think anybody just ends up in cybersecurity or focusing on that niche specifically. So it looks like you have a background in engineering. And so what was that initial curiosity, to go into understanding software development, understanding engineering? Maybe there was something related back to cybersecurity and the origination of it, but let us know what that was like.
Yeah, no. So I started in the late '80s. So I'm a little bit older than you. At the National Security Agency, and came straight out of Valparaiso University. My brother was a sales guy, so he was I could go through all the list of like 12 companies he worked for, but salesman of the year for a lot of big name companies. It started with Data General, Silicon Graphics, Honeywell, worked for IBM, a bunch of other companies, and he was always going to some he was always platinum or diamond club, in Great Barrier Reef or somewhere in the world, doing very well. So he was in sales, but he told me, get a degree in computer science because that's where the jobs are going to be. And it was great advice back, in the '80s. And so I started my career at NSA, got my master's degree at Johns Hopkins in actually computer science as well, but it focused on networking and it wasn't so much security back in the early days, but it was all NSA. The line then and still is, security is our middle name, right? So everything with culture of security, information security was there. It was back in those early days. It was all about really working on interoperability across different vendors. You had, it wasn't TCP/IP, you had OSI/IP and DECnet and all kinds of different technologies that couldn't talk to each other before the internet was really even out there. So love that. Great experience at NSA, getting my master's. And then we lived in England for 7 years, working for Lockheed and Mantech in an NSA, basically a US-UK military base, but all different networking technologies, got Cisco certified, did a lot of networking work, loved it, but also got into management and loved management and led a networking team that grew from kind of 20 to 40 people, got to travel the world a little bit. I won't go into too much of what I did in the intelligence community, but then we moved to Michigan. So my wife's family is from Michigan. Was 17 years in Michigan government. So a lot of different roles in Michigan before I jumped back to the private sector, but did a lot of, I was an agency CIO. I became the state's first CISO, Chief Security Officer, first CISO for all 50 state governments back in '02. And loved the job, loved the experience. What got me jumping back, it's really kind of interesting transition. I'll tell you real quick, Chris, a little story. people like your stories. When I first joined state government, it was all about Y2K. It was all, year 2000. Nobody was really into security at all. It was more like people used to tap me on the shoulder and say, we don't need screensavers. We don't need, we need to protect these things. We're not NSA now, are we? And they would almost laugh at me. But after 9/11, that changed dramatically. And some people may think, well, 9/11 wasn't even hitting Michigan, right? But the whole, online, not inline thing, we had built all these websites, we'd shut down all these physical locations, and everyone realized we really needed to do cybersecurity. And I had an NSA background. I was a natural choice for the first CISO. Loved the job. Got to work with the initial DHS when it was stood up, in the Bush administration. Did a lot of work with other states and working a lot with Homeland Security. So really did a ton of work there and became the state CTO, Chief Technology Officer. So it grew to kind of, we had 50,000 state employees. We had, 10 million citizens in Michigan. So big user base and, basically got involved, 800 staff, 400 contractors, big infrastructure operation. Then I went back to be CSO. We brought physical and cybersecurity together. So just loved working with people, loved leadership and teamwork. Was able to work with some amazing people. I can tell you some stories about that. But yeah, and then I jumped back to the private sector after that. So that's a little bit of background on my career.
Got it. And what would you say like is the biggest difference between being like an operator and then a lead transitioning to a leader? What skill sets did you have to maybe, I don't know if you organically had them or inherently had them versus ones that you had to learn? Obviously there's those that sometimes they don't inherently have them and they want to go to a leadership role and there's skill sets they have to adopt. And then others that just know and have the self-awareness that they don't have those skill sets and they just continue to be an operator and do well doing that. So what was kind of the thing that compelled you there and what were the differences?
Yeah, it's funny. I come of the start lead with a Tim Tebow quote. Leaders are people who others will follow, and but I mean obviously that takes skill set. I played quarterback in football at Valparaiso and in high school and very into sports, very competitive. So I've led teams my whole life in sports. I do a lot of blogging and writing around the overlap between football and cybersecurity and the similarities, attack, defend, and leadership. So I do think leadership, in any area of life, whether it be sports, technology, companies, there's a lot of overlap between, natural skill sets where you, but I think certainly there's been a lot of great leadership classes that I've taken, kind of the Covey School, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, kind of building your influence and getting involved in, I've been very blessed to have a lot of great training, both at NSA, but then state of Michigan, literally offsites and team building. But I think working, a desire and a focus on the team and not just focusing on your own success, but also on being the best you can be at what you do, but also helping others in their career, mentoring others, working with others. Those things came over time. I think for me, it was always a desire to be the best at what I possibly could control. I can't control everything, but also surrounding myself with people who were really, A, great at what they did, but B, a desire for them to fill in my weak spots. And so really always able to watch some other great leaders like Terry Takai was one of my bosses. She was CIO for the state of Michigan. She went on to become CIO for the state of California under Arnold Schwarzenegger, then CIO for the U.S. Department of Defense. Watching women leaders, watching other leaders in government, people who become CEOs like you, Ken Tice, others who built companies and grew it. Those things all helped. But I think leadership for me really, and especially when we talk about thought leadership, I also desire, a desire to learn, desire to grow, kind of reading a ton, blogging. I started blogging, one of the first bloggers for CISO magazine in '06. So I've been blogging for, almost 18 years now and writing and written 3 books. But just a desire to learn and grow, desire to work with others and build teams. I think, getting leadership, but some of it, I would say it's both for me. It's been kind of a natural leader because I was in sports leading as a quarterback, but also having great training.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of alluded to a couple of points, which I mean, I think that's a natural curiosity for a lot of people is like, how do they make the transition as they grow in their careers to the natural evolution is going to be some kind of like leadership position, right? And so I think like,
Yep.
uh, some people have that inherently, some people don't, but I think it's the ability to have that self-awareness, humility,
Yep.
natural curiosity. I feel like a lot of leaders, will self-admittedly, usually state that they're not the smartest person in the room, and that's a good thing because
Yep.
and I think that speaks more to their personality type in terms of, there's always more to learn. There's always somebody else that has some insights that they're not aware of or we're not aware of, and we can pick up from that. And ultimately, I feel like the best leaders are crowdsourcing that information set and then just have the ability to dilute it in some way and digest it and then be able to regurgitate that to other people and almost like a translation of some sort.
I love
That,
that. I love the humility is huge. I totally agree. And humble and hungry is one line that
yeah.
I've heard other people use, and I hunger to learn more, but humble, and I love that. Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said.
Yeah. And so I want to go into you wrote a book called Cyber Mayday and the Day After, right? Like, you've had several decades of security experience, seen probably tons of cycles, things that like people were, like you mentioned Y2K were afraid of that never really fully transpired, but like a lot of legwork went into kind of preparing
Yeah.
for things like that. And you mentioned 9/11, obviously, which is a big thing. Um, it's interesting because I feel like these moments of terror is what does typically spur security nationally. I had a conversation with another like security expert, and we were on the topic of why is the EU have more security in place, and we had this discussion around World War II and
Yeah.
how the German Nazis and going through that experience then forced a lot of Europe to then be really heightened in how they looked at security and how that translates into cybersecurity in that part of the world. Um, but yeah, just I mean, without going into too much of a tangent, let's talk about a little bit more of like your overarching philosophy of how to look at cybersecurity, right? Like for the typical layperson that's just going through their day to day, not even worrying because there are people like you that's out there. What is cybersecurity in its most general sense, and then how does that translate to then both public and private sectors in terms of how you have to build up the infrastructure to watch for that?
Yeah, Chris, you made so many great points there, and I'm a big believer in learning from history as well, um, and totally agree that I guess my overarching view would be I give it a couple. I know people want to hear some stories, but
Yeah, of course.
um, I my overarching view is cybersecurity is a part of every day of our life, every part of our lives, because technology is a part of every part of our lives, from your smartphone to your Gmail account or your Yahoo account that you use at home to your work to now with AI and robotics and everything, data everywhere, more and more data, more and more chatbots, and cybersecurity is like the glue in the middle that really brings a lot of that together because nobody wants, yeah, you want to do online banking, for example. We want to do all these different things that we've come to, assume that we can, do a Venmo payment with our smartphone. But of course, you want it to be secure when it happens. You don't want that to be hacked, and you don't want your data to go to the criminals and have ransomware attacks. So many stories I can share. I mentioned a couple of them in the book, and the book really, Cyber Mayday and the Day After. It's all about true ransomware stories from all over the world. I have a
Hmm.
co-author from Sydney, Australia. It's a long story. I don't have time to go into it today with you, but I'll tell a couple other stories from the book. But how Shemaine and I met each other. I was actually going to be doing a conference in Sydney, Australia, going to a wedding, and 9/11, not 9/11. I'm sorry, COVID hit in 2020, and canceled it all out. We ended up doing it online. It ended up being a big success. We ended up having, like, instead of 300 people, we had like 1,000 people at this global event. But then we became friends and canceled 3 trips to Australia that that with my family, the wedding went on. We didn't get to go because of COVID. We finally ended up going last Christmas, by the way, which was awesome. Our first time to Australia. But we Shemaine and I ended up writing a book together around true ransomware stories, and that's kind of the worst case scenario for a lot of organizations, companies, individuals when you get hit by ransomware, which is that attack that encrypts all your data or knocks you off the air. You can't access your data. And so many true stories and so many, it's happening all around us. What can you do before, during, and after an incident? And there's 35 true stories in there through the eyes of the C-suite, through the eyes of not just security pros, but through any technology or business leader. What can you do to prepare? What can you do before, during, and after an incident? How do you practice? How do you do tabletop exercises? We cover all that in the book. But one of the lessons I mentioned, I'll tell you, one of the stories, is so many stories I can tell you, really does go back, talking about history. You mentioned 9/11, we talked about, but I was actually in Michigan government in 2003 when the blackout happened, the Northeast blackout. And we learned a ton of lessons from that I'm still applying today to cybersecurity. When the lights went out in Michigan and the whole Northeast, many people watching or listening will know, was maybe that happened to you in New York or Cleveland or somewhere else that lost power. And when that first happened, I was an emergency management coordinator, and a lot of crazy things happened. We thought it was another 9/11, a lot of misinformation, which is true today. A lot of people saying, a bomb had gone off in the White House, of course that didn't happen. A lot of things were supposedly happening that were not true. So, fake news was happening even 20 years ago. But one of the things that we learned right out of the gate when we showed up at our state's emergency coordination center, which had, we had electrical power there, we had generator backup, about 2/3 of the people didn't show up. And then 1/3, one third never showed up. And some of that was good reasons. They were on vacation. The guy who was supposed to be in charge was actually on vacation in Mexico City at the time. So he never showed up. The person who did run the emergency 10 years later became the director of Michigan State Police and got a good promotion because she was ready and she was prepared and she did a great job. But so one of the lessons I tell people when you're practicing for emergencies, don't assume that all the people that are prepared, that have the books, that have been trained, are the ones that are actually going to be there, because in many cases they're not. I actually do tabletop exercises, go around and tap people on the shoulder and say, a third of you, take the day off, go home, because you're on vacation right now, going down the Rhine River in Europe. You're not here. And it's funny to watch that, Chris. Immediately, people often will say, well, take Sarah the intern. Don't take Frank. They want to swap people in and out, because no, we need, our whole plan is built on Frank or whoever the person may be, guy, man or woman, whoever knows all this information. So preparing not just with of course backups and having a plan, having a strategy, all those things are important, but with the people and having backups with your people, it's a huge issue. And we learned a lot. That's just one lesson, but that applies still today, that we learned during the blackout. But there's many, many more that we talk about in the book.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I feel like not enough, the general population isn't fully aware of the work that goes into the ease of use of the technology that they have at their disposal, right? We almost blindly go and maneuver through this technology, and we are forthcoming with this data. A lot of people don't even know, even with regulations saying that you have to now accept all your cookies and being tracked and all that stuff. And obviously there's companies get smart to that, and they make it very difficult for you to opt out of rejecting them to get your cookies, right? And so I find that funny, but it's also just, I think, a little bit buyer beware kind of situation too. I think the population needs to a little bit more educated about that. But talk us through a little bit around, this preparedness, right? It's like a digital version of a natural disaster. And I think, let's, from the perspective of, again, just more like the typical layperson of, why is their data valuable? especially at scale, right? Like
Sure.
from an organization that's collecting that data. So when they're giving it up freely, like maybe individually it's not as valuable, but in a pool of data, when does that become valuable? When does that become a target for a bad actor to go and then try to get that pool of data? And then, like you're talking about with ransomware and having to deal with those in real time, when that data becomes hostage to whatever the organization or to that bad actor, and then how does that play out? If you can walk us through, and maybe that's
Sure.
through a story or what have you, but why
No.
is how does that happen? Why is that relevant?
Well, first of all, the criminals are just trying to make money, right?
Yeah.
So the bad actors, and they're all over the world. It's flat in the world. Freedom in the world is flat. And so it can be no matter what size organization you're a part of, or you're just home business, your own side gig, side hustle, whatever. My brother had a business. I won't go into the details, but he got hit by ransomware and ended up having to pay an $1,100 ransom. And so that was a few years back, but it can hit people at home. It can hit small businesses all the way up to large banks and corporations, and things like the Colonial Pipeline, and major hospitals, and more and more and more every day are hit by this. And so it's whatever they can do to get access. Sometimes that access can happen via just somebody clicking on a link they shouldn't be clicking on, and giving identity. So being aware of phishing attempts that happen, people trying to trick you into doing things. A little bit of advice, right? Stop for a second. People should be using multi-factor authentication as much as possible. And we can even talk more detail about in the future, even going beyond, getting a PIN, sent to your phone, and using an authenticator, and using Google or Microsoft authenticators or others are even more helpful. But making sure it's not just a username and password, because your passwords can get stolen, they will get stolen, and it may not even be your fault. It could be a database that gets hacked on the other side of the world. More and more, the criminals are in the dark web, able to buy credentials, and they're logging in with your accounts. They're not even hacking anymore. They're just literally buying the credentials from so
Mm.
many of these data breaches that have happened around the world. They're buying it on the dark web. So being able to just have a multi-factor authentication is huge. The identity is really important for all of us to use, even on your LinkedIn accounts, your Gmail accounts, your home accounts, certainly on your work accounts, your banking accounts. You need to use multi-factor. It's usually free. Use it. But once they get in, they can get access to that data. Whatever they can do to, if you have a backup, people should have backups. Back up your data at home on your laptops. Use a USB drive. You're listening to this, go back. Back up that data. Not necessarily the whole operating system and everything. You can do that if you want to, but that's easy to restore. That data, whether that's family pictures, whether that's company data, whatever it is, if they have that and they know that you want it, and you're gonna and you say to get it back, we're gonna, it could be $1,000 ransom, it could be $100,000, it could be millions, depending on what it is we're talking about. And they're gonna go after those backups. They're gonna go in. They're gonna go in. They're gonna get into your systems. They're gonna try and delete your backups. So backups that are not just online or in the cloud, but also offline, available, that easily can be restored, or important. And have organizations need a plan. They need to have a security incident response plan. What are we going to do if this happens? And that just doesn't include the security pros. That's not going to include I'm now talking mid-sized, large corporations now, not individuals, but your lawyers, your finance department, training people who do those bank transfers, what is and what is not normal. Having one other tip right here, Chris, and I'll stop it and you can ask some more questions. But having the freedom in your organization, talk about thought leadership and leadership, having the ability for all of your employees to know that they can question something if something doesn't seem right, if it seems out of ordinary. If you get an email from your CEO and it says, "Hey Dan, I need you to transfer $1 million over to this Swiss bank account," maybe you would laugh at that and say, I would never do that. But you'd be surprised at what we call business email compromise, at the number of tricks that criminals will use. They'll even hack into your Gmail account. I've seen this happen and trick CEOs, sidebar conversations about, hey, we're going to the football game next weekend, this and that and the other thing. Oh, by the way, can you do this for me real quick? Can you give me access to this? Can you do this? Can you do that? Is that really coming from your boss? Is it coming from somewhere else? Oftentimes they're using those credentials. They're then getting access to the systems, and then they're committing their crimes. So they're very, very good at tricking people. Deep fakes is a big issue. Faking accounts, faking, it's not really from your boss, but you think it is. So if enabling your culture of your company to say, you know, this doesn't seem right to me, I'm going to check out a band. Is this really legitimate? And having employees with the ability to ask those questions is a huge part of building a culture of security, because I think a lot of times these hacks are happening, these ransomware attacks, these other cyber attacks, because people are afraid that I can't ask the CFO or the CEO or the CIO or someone else, you know, what's going on. So, you know, asking for help is a big part of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I working with tons of startups, I've seen that happen more and more frequently, where even like the smaller organizations are being, you know, attacked, or one of the more recent ones that I've started to see pop up a lot is acting as if they are an employee and then wanting to switch, get their
Yep.
their paycheck switched to something else or what have you.
Yep.
Pretty common now.
Pretending to be an HR executive.
Yeah,
Hey, I'm so and so. Can you update your social security number? Could you, you know, fill out this form, whatever? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Few things. I mean, so as you were talking about that, I thought about the LinkedIn breaches. I've also thought about, I mean, LinkedIn is a common
Yep.
place for cyber attacks, obviously because of the amount of data that they have in there. Um, and I also just think it's like somewhat interesting that that those breaches have, like, I think built a lot of businesses in the tech space. I think of like Zoom Info and like Apollo, where they've ultimately aggregated a lot of that data from probably some of these breaches. But without going into that too much,
Yeah.
you talked about AI, the advent of AI, deep fakes, you know, some of these
Yep.
things that start becoming really concerning because it's a lot easier. Well, not easy, both. A lot easier to imitate other people and
Yep.
more difficult because of the level of technology, more difficult to discern what's real and what's not real. And so I guess what are your thoughts around that topic? And maybe there's a few perspective or a few lenses to take a look at it from, which is, well, number one, like, is there anything government can do where, you know, we have to label things that are, you know, AI produced or created, and not is, and is that even realistic? Because is there a way for us to get back to the root of the origination of whatever it is that the consumer is viewing or consuming? So that's one question. And then, and the second part would just, you know, be like, outside of any regulatory practices that the government could potentially institute, is there anything that a consumer should be looking out for? You mentioned some of those best practices, right? Like multi-factor authentication in any shape, way, form possible. But like, you know, authenticators like Microsoft and Google offering
Yep.
those through your mobile device. You're seeing that pop up more frequently, but like, I think a lot of the general population also similarly thinks it is a point of friction, and so they don't spend the time to do it. But how important is that now starting to become relevant as we start getting into technology that starts, yeah, making that line a little bit more blurrier?
And it's great questions, and we could spend a whole session just on those.
I'm
But
sure,
I'm
yeah,
just
yeah,
saying, no, it's all good. I'll give you a couple. I mean, I do believe we're going to have to start having more and more seals of authenticity. And there's a variety of different products and services out there, you know, marked, you know, like I said, marked, you know, computer generated, AI generated, Gen AI generated. You know, I think you're going to see more and more, whether that be Adobe, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, others offering those. You know, I think that's got to happen, because, you know, the point about deepfakes is huge, and you know, you are starting to see more and more laws around, you know, some things like deepfake porn, you know, being outlawed. I think there's going to be stuff on the fringes, mandating regulatory wise how, you know, something is stamped legitimate or not, or you know, I do I see regulation coming? I do. I think the better solution, it's like, I mean, I'm not a big proponent of just you know, bottom line, what the best solution would be is if really intuitive, good solutions were offered by the likes of the Microsofts, the Googles, the Apples, the OpenAI, that was built in as a feature rather than mandated by the government. Because
Mm,
when you get mandated by the government, number one, you got battles going on about which standard do you want to use.
mm,
Is it interoperable? And then just like people, I'm literally doing a podcast later this afternoon on ransomware. And one of the questions, a lot of states are outlawing ransomware payments. Is that a good or a bad thing? You can outlaw the ransomware payments for that governments might pay, but doesn't necessarily stop the bad guys from continuing to have ransomware. So, I mean, just by you creating a law or a regulation doesn't necessarily mean people are going to abide by it. So I tend to be more open and encouraging of free market solutions that work well. And so I would encourage developers and I would encourage the companies out there in these spaces to give us solutions built in that tell us, is this human generated or is this not? But remember that the bad actors are going to do what they can to trick you. As soon as you come out with something, Chris, you come out with a great product or service, they're going to come out and they're going to try and imitate that and hack it or make it look like it's not real. So we're going to be in this for the rest of our lives. What's real, what's not, what's a deep fake, what's not. Do we trust that news? Do we trust that media? Do we trust that social media post? Was that really my mom? Was that really my cousin, my brother, my kid? Those are hard questions, and I think we're going to be battling with that for the next decade. That's part of security. I do think government has a big role to play and will play a role. I tend to think government's going to be reactive when it comes to AI and Gen AI and deep fakes, and they're going to outlaw things that are, deep fake porn for minors. I think is an easy one to go after first. It's kind of a low hanging fruit kind of thing. But more and more regulation is also being pushed back on by the industry. So we'll have to see how it develops. I do think we're going to see a mixture of both.
interesting. On that note, we're up on time, and I
Yeah.
think it's a great way to end it. But thank you so much for carving out some time today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.
Of course.